welcome to my sewing room. I have a wonderful show for you today. The theme of the show is shadow work embroidery by hand and shadow work embroidery by machine. Wonderful techniques. Where do you use these two techniques? Well, let me share a few items with you before we begin. This is a beautiful, beautiful quilt with the word BB on the front and beautiful bows and flowers and the beautiful shadow work embroidery by hand. This blouse has shadow work embroidery by machine on it in beautiful shades of pink and green, this lady's blouse. I have another lady's blouse for you that has elegant work also. This has shadow work embroidery by machine down the front, as well as a beautiful panel, a French waterfall panel down the front. This child's dress, an older girl's dress, has an exquisite collar. This one is shadow work embroidery by hand. I have another older girl's dress, which is perfectly beautiful also. This has shadow work embroidery by hand on the collar with these beautiful little bows. And let me turn this over to the back. This is one of the sweetest designs and one of the sweetest collars in the back with the little bunny rabbits rolling the eggs and a little bow on the back. Now, shadow work can be just as beautiful for women's clothes as it is for children's clothes. This is an elegant woman's dress with shadow work embroidery by hand, white on both sides of the collar. And now then, I'd like for you to come over with me where I have a very famous guest who will teach you shadow work embroidery by hand. I'm so pleased to have as my guest today Margaret Boyles from Atlanta. Margaret has authored 25 books on needlework. And Margaret, it is certainly my pleasure to welcome you to the show.
Well, thank you. I'm so happy to be here, especially to talk about shadow embroidery, which is one of my favorite kinds of embroidery, partly because it's so true to our Victorian heritage with the embroideries, and partly because it's so beautiful, fast, and fun to do. I brought with me a pillow with some shadow embroidery on it, which I wanted to show you first just to give you an idea of what it is. If you look closely at the blue bow, you'll notice that the outline is a little bit darker than the color inside the bow. This is because most of the thread is on the back of the bow. The bow and all the flowers and the leaves on this pillow are done in shadow embroidery with a beautiful hand-dyed cotton embroidery floss. Then there's some little accents of straight stitches and French knots, which are fun to add. The stitch is really a very easy stitch. Thank you. I start away from where I'm going to work with a waist knot, which fastens my thread. And I've drawn two parallel lines because it's easiest to learn the stitch if you work between two lines. Bring your thread up from the back, make a little back stitch, then directly below the first stitch, bring the needle to the surface again, make a back stitch. I'm working quite large so that you can see what I'm doing. This embroidery, it's essential to work on a hoop because the stitches are quite long. And it's also correct to do this either on the right or the wrong side. I'm working on the right side because I think it's the easiest to do. And it is prettiest if it's on the sheer or semi-sheer fabric. What I have is a beautiful Swiss batiste, which is one of my favorites to work on. The thread I'm using is a cotton floche, which is fairly heavy. But normally, on things like the pillow, I would work with a single strand of 6-strand embroidery thread and probably a 7 or an 8 needle. Now you can see that by working back and forth like I'm working, I'm putting a lot of thread on the back of my piece. If you turn it over, you'll see these pretty little X's on the back. If you look at it from the right side and you put your fabric under here, you can see just a shadow of the blue under it with the darker blue outlining it. Now to do a flower or a leaf, you work exactly the same way. I've started this flower and done one petal and filled the center with French knots. And then to do the actual shadow embroidery, you just work back and forth. Now right here comes one of the interesting little things. These two pieces join. So I'm going to work the stitches on one side right on top of each other. It'll make them a little bit heavier, but that creates another different shadow. And you just work back and forth simply like this. And you can see the thread on the back, which is what gives you your shadow. Now, if I wanted to work a leaf, or let's start up here with the bow, your lines are, you pretend these are just parallel lines, but you work closer and just follow your line. So you just come up, make your little stitches. This is one of the embroideries that is such fun to do because it's as pretty in white on white or ecru on ecru as it is in color. It's wonderful on baby clothes as well as on collars and linens and so forth. It's essential that when you come up and go down, you go down in exactly the same hole that you made when you came up before. And just work back and forth. You can see this is fast. It's a fast embroidery, but it's so pretty. And that's basically the stitch. Now, if I wanted to do a leaf, which I've sketched down here, you have a choice. You could do this in 2 sections, which is what I would do. I don't like to make my stitches too long unless they're going to be covered with a facing or something. But it's exactly the same thing. Just work back and forth on these stitches and just relax and have fun. But do put it in a hoop.
Well, Margaret, thank you so much for sharing this most exquisite embroidery with us. I think this is fast and easy embroidery too, and especially now that you've shown us how. Thank you so much, Margaret. And next we have a doll dress for you. My doll is wearing a beautiful dress which features a shadow work embroidery by machine, Windmill. The dress is done in white and blue. Notice this absolutely beautiful little silk ribbon bow here. I started to say shadow work bow. That's not shadow work. Come down the front of the skirt to the Windmill, which is shadow work embroidery by machine. Now these little tulips are silk ribbon embroidery by hand. There is a sweet, sweet little detail I'd like to show you here. There is piping between the skirt and the little blue ruffle which has lace at the bottom. I'd like to show you how to attach that ruffle on the bottom. When I run 2 rows of gathering in the ruffle, and I always run 2 rows because I just think it makes a prettier gathering. And by the way, let me share with you a trick. I pull the bobbin threads, and the reason I do is because if I were to pull the top threads, it makes the threads lock up a little more easily. Another trick, if you think you're going to forget which are the bobbin threads and which are the top threads, is simply to come in here as I have done and cut those top threads sort of short so the bobbin threads will be the long ones. Now after I pull and distribute these gathers, I will go to my skirt. Now on this skirt I have already attached some piping. It can be bias or non-bias, but I've attached piping to the bottom. After I gather the skirt, I place it right sides to right sides. Down on this piping, another thing I'm going to do is to place the 2 gathers to place the piping right in the middle of those 2 gathers, so when I sew them together, I will not sew on one of those gathering threads. Then I pin it and I go back from the right side and I stitch over that same line of stitching where I attached my piping. Now, other technique which you saw on this dress is shadow work embroidery by machine, which is so quick and so much fun and so easy. Okay, I transfer the design, which is the Windmill, onto this fabric. Now I'm going to do these little wheels of the Windmill in blue. So I put a big piece of blue fabric behind here, stitch around the wheels of the windmill, come back, and then you see that you can see here in the darker printing that that is where I will go around for the first row. Now I'm going to make that a little bit more clear. Let's come over here and look at this collar on the dress. This collar has two beautiful butterflies. The collar also has a pretty entredot and gathered lace trim there. Let me share with you how that collar is done. Now I have drawn the two butterflies off on this collar. The first part I'm going to shadow work embroidery by machine are the little blue wings in the center of the body. So behind here I have a piece of water-soluble stabilizer and a blue piece of fabric because the butterfly wings are going to be blue. Why do I have this water-soluble stabilizer, which looks a little like plastic under here? It makes it easier for me not to cut the fabric when I come in to trim away this after I've stitched it down. The second step over here shows I have already trimmed away the blue fabric, which it looks a little like a butterfly on the bottom too. Now then I'm going to do the upper wings, so I put a yellow piece of fabric. Remember, your stabilizer, your water-soluble stabilizer is still behind there. It is now time to stitch the yellow wings, which are right here, the blue wings and the yellow wings, and then embellish with that pretty gold thread. And now everything has been cut away except the water-soluble stabilizer. That can be dissolved later. Now this collar has a really pretty curve that goes around it, and if you remember, it had entredot and gathered lace around that curve. In order to attach gathered lace to entredot, I'm going to trim this seam allowance away. The entredot comes like this. I'm going to trim the seam allowance away. I'm going to come in and find the gathering thread built into the side of my French and English lace. I'm going to slip it up here like this. I'm going to gather it. I'm going to butt it together like this and zigzag it. And then if I'm going to go around a curve, which I am going to do in this case, I will come in here and clip the curves so my entredot and lace piece will go easily around the curve. Now I have invited Louise Baird to show you how to shadow applique and how to construct a beautiful shadow applique quilt. We are now going to share with you how it is that one constructs this beautiful shadow applique quilt. Also, let's have a little review of exactly how you do this beautiful shadow applique by machine. I have invited as my guest today Louise Baird, who, by the way, made that quilt. Louise is one of the top sewing machine artists in the United States and in the whole world as far as I'm concerned. Louise, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Martha. And like Martha said, we're just going to have a little review on the shadow applique by machine. So to begin with, when you try to decide the color that you're going to use, you want to place a color fabric underneath a sheer fabric, and the colors that show through will help you decide what color thread to use. Generally, when you do the shadow applique, your thread needs to sort of match the color that shows through. Also, you will find that if you try a dark fabric, even though you think that that's the right color, it ends up looking more muddy looking color than a clear color. So the clear colors really do look a little bit better than the darker colors. Also, choose a stitch, either a tiny zigzag, a buttonhole stitch, or a blind hem stitch. Whatever stitch you use, you want a tiny stitch, and remember that you would use matching thread. Now here I have started tracing my design onto my sheer upper fabric, and again you want to have your fabric relatively starched stiffly. Now, as I go to do the shadow applique, you would just place a block of fabric behind your work, and on this type of applique, you work foreground to background instead of as regular applique where you work background to foreground. Now I'm going to just stitch here right along the line, and most of the time when I do my stitching I sort of make a V with my fingers and I use an open toe applique foot, and that allows me to guide my fabric. The machines today will do all the stitching that's needed. Now, when you finish doing your stitching and trim your threads, then you would come to the wrong side and trim away your fabric close. And that trick that Martha had a little while ago about placing the stabilizer underneath it really does help to keep your fabric from cutting your fabric, so that you've got a nice clean edge that's not cut. So that's really all there is to do the shadow applique.
Now, Louise, I can't wait to see how you construct that quilt.
Okay.
All right, I bet everybody's been looking forward to that.
The construction really is pretty easy. After you have completed the quilt top, then you need to make your quilt sandwich. Now, this is just a little sample with several pieces of fabric. I've got my backing, my quilt backing, the layers of batting, whatever type of batting that you want to use in it. And then, since this is a shadow applique, you need a lining for the applique. And then you want to baste your quilt together. There's several different ways that you can baste it. One is with a machine long basting stitch. Another is just hand basting. And you can also use a quilt tack gun, which is sort of like a staple gun, but it's made especially for quilting, or safety pins, so that everything is together and it doesn't shift at all while you're making it. Now you need to cut the bias strips, and I do not like to work in a continuous bias binding, so I like to cut my strips and then stitch them together. So if I take my fabric, selvage to selvage, open it out, and fold it on the bias, and then continue to fold, always keeping that fold, the bias fold together, you will end up with a very short piece of fabric that you have to cut. So you would clip off of the folded edge and then cut your bias strips, and you would end up with all of these bias strips together that you would stitch together. To pin the bias strips together, you would just need to lay the one down and then have the other at a right angle. I like to draw a line, and it's that line on which I sew. Now, in doing the quilt, adding the quilt, when you cut your bias binding, you want to cut it 6 times your finished binding, and you would just fold it like this. Is going to be a 1/2 inch finished edge, so therefore I cut it at 2 inches, and you would just stitch at the 1/2 inch mark. To make a mitered corner, I stitch until I'm a 1/2 inch from my edge, since I'm having a 1/2 inch bias binding. Tie off there, and then fold your bias back so that it meets the edge of your quilt, and then do the miter. And I usually will make a little mark here, fold this back up, put it under the machine, and again start right at this mark, and then I'm through.
Louise, would you please show us how to fold over that binding?
Sure, Martha. With the mitered corner, as easy as it was to starting and stopping it, all you need to do is fold it over, and then to the wrong side, go ahead and miter this one side and miter the other. And then you would generally either whip stitch it by hand or stitch in the ditch with your sewing machine, and that's all there is to it.
Show me the front of that, if you will, Louise. When you pull it up like that. All right. Well, oh, thank you so much. I think that quilt is out of this world, and I thank you so much for sharing with us how to make it.
Thank you, Martha.
Now I have a beautiful home decorating item for you. I have a beautiful pillow to go along with the shadow applique quilt. Taking motifs from the quilt, this has the butterfly motif, the iris that was in the basket, and these precious little flowers that were scattered throughout the basket and on the top of the quilt. We have combined these beautiful motifs on the front of a really pretty pillow. I kind of like this really full ruffle that goes all the way around it too. I'm going to turn this pillow over to the back to show you it has just one of these easy, slip the pillow in and out, and in case you would like to wash it. And of course, being white batiste, you will want to wash it. This is a very easy and actually very practical type of a pillow back. Now, to make the back to this pillow, it's really very easy. The first piece of fabric for the back, and it's done in 2 pieces. I take 1.5 to 2 inches and fold it over one time, and then I fold it over one more time, and then I straight stitch both of those sides. I make one for the left and one for the right. Then I overlap these 2, and that will be stitched onto the back of my pillow. Now then, let me refresh your memory one more time. What does shadow applique look like? Well, you see what it looks like from the front. And from the back, you will see the pieces of fabric, the different colors, the pink and the orange and the yellow and the green and the blue that were put on behind, stitched around, and then clipped away. Shadow applique pillows that are done on Swiss batiste do have to have a lining because they're too thin otherwise. So after I do the shadow applique, I will go ahead and straight stitch a lining to go behind it all the way around. Now this ruffle is really pretty. It has lace stitched on the edge using Martha's Magic. Gather it around, taking a lot of care to pin, especially around the corners, and you do need extra fullness around each corner. And carefully pin all of this fullness away, because if you don't, when you put your backing on, you're going to have those little ruffles and you have to pick it out and sew it again. All right, now then we're going to put the ruffle around here real carefully all the way around, except I'm not going to do it and pin it. We're going to fix that where it's just right, and then right sides to right sides, I will put the backing down and simply straight stitch around, reach in and turn the pillow right side out, and then get a pillow form that fits it. I'll tell you what, I really like pillows and quilts that match, and you can make our quilt for this series in any size you want to make it, for a baby bed, for a twin bed, or even up to a king-size bed, and make several of these pretty pillows to go along with it. Now I would like to invite you up to my attic, where I have a beautiful little girl's dress with some wonderful embroidery on it. I purchased this little Victorian midi dress in Paris. Now, there are many, many features to this dress which I think are exciting. Starting here at the top, we have the center panel has sets of 2 tucks, and there are 3 sets of those 2 tucks. Swiss embroideries embellish the sides of the front panel, as well as these wonderful little dots. I think those are so cute. It almost looks like the measles have been embroidered in this dress. The little pigeon-breasted front is quite typical of the era. You know, even the sleeves have some of the beautiful Swiss entredot trim. It almost looks like eyelets in the middle, the beautiful flowers, and then a little bit of gathered French lace on either side. You know, the skirts on these dresses are absolutely wonderful. The tucks, I think that if there's anything that I just love the best, it would have to be tucks. This one has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 tucks, little tiny folded tucks, about 1/8 of an inch. Then some more of the beautiful Swiss embroidery with entredot on either side. And then the final ruffle is really, once again, Swiss embroidery and has a place for beading. My guess would be that a long time ago, the ribbon had been run through this beading. Now let me show you this one little thing, if I can pull it over here. That's a little repair. See the little patch that's in behind there with tiny little stitches? Let me turn it up for you to see. That little patch right there that has repaired. Some people say to me, well, Martha, you know, some of the things that I get have holes in them. And you know what I say? Those holes just make them even more wonderful. If you would like to repair your antique things, you can put netting behind them if it has lace and kind of sew it. And you say, well, exactly how do you sew it? Well, it's just a little bit like you just do it. But it's okay to repair your antique things, and it's okay to buy something with a hole in it or that has been repaired. Thank you so much for joining me today in my sewing room. I hope you've had as much fun as I have. I would like to invite you to be with me next time.